Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this session on how leaders can address racism and care for colleagues of color. My name is Jim Ludema, and I'm the director of the Center for Values-Driven Leadership at Benedictine University. And as we get started, let me make a couple of comments about the technology. We would like to ask everyone, except for our panelists, to please turn off your video and put your audio on mute. That said, we will take your questions throughout today's session using the Zoom chat box. You can send messages to the host of the meeting, which is listed as Center for Values-Driven Leadership, and our colleague Amber Johnson will be monitoring that chat stream. Now, just a brief word about the Center for Values-Driven Leadership and our connection to today's topic. Our mission is to help values-driven leaders build flourishing companies that have a transformative impact on business and society. And we believe that if it is truly flourishing and transformation that we want, then perhaps the most pressing issue of our time that we must address as academics and as business leaders is the reality and the destructive impact of systemic racism. And this belief has set us on a long-term journey to understand, to amplify the voices of diverse leaders and scholars, and to take action. And one form of action we are taking is to host a series of executive education seminars addressing racism and building inclusive organizations, of which today's seminar is the first. And of course, today is a very special day because it is the 155th anniversary of Juneteenth. In 1865, orders were read in Galveston, Texas, announcing to the 250,000 slaves in that state that they were free. The Emancipation Proclamation had been signed 2.5 years earlier, but word and change moved slowly. But on that day in 1865, former enslaved people celebrated their freedom. The following year, they began to mark it as a holiday, and now, often called America's second Independence Day, Juneteenth is an annual opportunity for all Americans to celebrate and to recognize and honor African American heritage. So that's the context that we bring to this session. We are part of a nation that enslaved its own people. And even after they were set free, our systems and laws and leaders have so far made true equality impossible to achieve. True safety and security for the Black community so far has also been impossible to achieve, as we have been reminded with the recent killings of Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, among so many others. COVID-19 has also reminded us of systemic inequality as Black and Latinx communities have been hit disproportionately hard. And it's with these realities in mind that on June 1, our first speaker for today, Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts, wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review in which she said, "No matter your racial, political, or other identity, these events are impossible to escape. In particular, millions of Black people and their allies are hurting deeply. These are issues that no organization or leader can ignore." And so with that, let me introduce you to Dr. Roberts and to our other panelists. Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts is a professor of practice at the Darden School of Business and a leading scholar on the science of maximizing human potential in diverse organizations and communities. She's published over 50 research articles, teaching cases, and practitioner-oriented tools focused on strength-based leadership development, workplace equity, and inclusion. She has served on the faculties of Harvard Business School, Georgetown's McDonough School of Business, and Antioch's Graduate School of Leadership and Change. Laura, we're delighted to have you here today. Laura is joined by two global thought leaders who happen to be members of our executive PhD program in values-driven leadership. The first is Dr. Selwa Rahim-Dillard, who is the Senior Manager of Diversity, Strategies, and Planning at US Cellular. Selwa graduated from our PhD program only a few weeks ago and wrote an outstanding dissertation titled Exploring the Antecedents, Practices, and Outcomes of Inclusive Leadership in America's Workplaces. Selwa has been designing and implementing diversity and inclusion strategies in corporations for over 15 years, and her passion is building inclusive leadership competence. Selwa, welcome.
Thanks, Jim.
The second is Cheryl Harris, and Cheryl is a current student in our PhD program and is the Chief Procurement Officer at Allstate, where she manages a $4 billion portfolio. At Allstate, she is part of an executive team hosting real and raw conversations about race. And she also oversees Allstate's supplier inclusion and sustainability programs. Cheryl was recently recognized as one of the most powerful Black executives in corporate America. Cheryl, welcome, and we look forward to learning from you today.
Thanks, Jim.
Now, let me just say a word about today's agenda. We'll first hear from Laura with her content on how organizations can address racism and care for colleagues of color. Then we'll do a few minutes of Q&A with her. And then we'll hear from Selwa on specific strategies that managers can employ to build inclusive organizations. And then we'll hear from Cheryl on what the work that she has done at Allstate. Then we'll spend the last 20 to 30 minutes or so in conversation with you, taking your questions that you send via chat to Amber and letting the panelists respond and dialogue with one another. So that's the flow of the day today. And with that, it's time for us to get started. So Dr. Roberts, let me turn it over to you to begin.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to the Center for Values-Based Leadership for holding the space for this important conversation today. An article just yesterday in Business Insider was published with the headline, "Diversity and Inclusion Are the Emptiest Words in Corporate America." And so I sat with that as I've been engaging in these conversations, and I began to reflect upon the implications of those words. In essence, I think it leads us to confront the ways in which so many of our efforts have proven insufficient to meet the challenges of the moment. We've engaged in this work with one-off events, feel-good programs, hoping for a quick fix for issues that can only be addressed through holistic and systematic approaches. For example, building human capital systems that take into account recruiting, team structure, promotions, and how pipelines disadvantage minority employees, according to two of my fellow colleagues and thought leaders in this space, Dr. Quinetta Roberson and Dr. Stephanie Creary. They also emphasize the importance of accountability metrics to track success. You know, what I would offer here is that our overarching plans will stick when they're aligned with values-based commitments, as well as considering, but sometimes secondarily considering, a market-based strategy. To dig a little deeper into this, what really is the problem with inclusion? Well, it depends on how you define inclusion. So if inclusion means inviting someone in, but then telling them where to sit and expecting them to follow the house rules, then you brought them into the space, but they can still be marginalized inside of that space. True inclusion exists when you don't balk because someone takes your seat. You move over to make room for other people. And that has been a perpetual sticking point in corporate, nonprofit, and educational initiatives. And to the question of diversity, we can't say that something counts if we're not even willing to count it. And most organizations are not even counting in terms of representation or making that data more available. If we were to conduct such an audit, what would we find? Who is here? And how do we show up literally as caregivers within our communities and our organizations? Well, among women of color, within their list of top 10 occupations, number 1 is cashier, but also on the list of top 10 occupations held by women of color are registered nurses, nursing assistants, personal care aides, as well as child care providers, home health aides, and a host of other caregiving roles. When you look at the demographic breakdown of home health providers and nursing assistants, over half are women of color. Over 40% of personal care aides and medical assistants are women of color. Who's doing the caregiving within our society today? On the other hand, when we look at the statistics for physicians, we are sobered by the fact that fewer Black men in total entered medical school in 2014 than entered medical school in 1978. For 12% of the population and a disproportionate represented in ongoing needs due to social determinants of health, we see that only 7.1% of current medical school enrollees are Black. That was in 2018, 2019. Now that number may look favorable compared to a plateau of 3%, which has been in place for almost 60 or more years, of the percentage of physicians in our United States that are Black. And that includes people of African descent. Within the current number of medical students, more like 2/3 of those are women and closer to 1/3 would be men. And then in that breakdown of men, there's still a much stronger representation of students of African descent versus US born African Americans. What is this telling us? Is this just about healthcare systems and caregiving? No, we look at the trends in corporate America, and over half Black Americans experience racism at work. It's not just out there, it's also in here in our workplaces. 3.2%, remember that number? 3%. 3.2% of executives and senior level managers are Black, according to Fortune. Polls also, Black men are paid 13% less than white men. Black women are paid 39% less than white men, 21% less than white women. They ask for promotions at the same rate. They lean in, raise their hands for leadership opportunities, but get worse results in terms of getting those chances to move up. So I'd like to pose a question today. What would it mean if we viewed our organizations and their leaders as responsible for healing, as sites of critical care to address the fractures and the open wounds of racism, not just out there, but also in here? The death by 1,000 cuts that come from microaggressions, as well as the violent assault. What if our caregiving included preventive care, developing these talent management systems, investing in them, promoting learning among the overrepresented people of color at entry and lower levels of organizations and low-wage workers, and then also providing pathways to the highest levels in organizations. Keep in mind, some of these initiatives were put into place 20 to 30 years ago, and they did generate in 2002, 12% of, in 2002, a peak of 12 Black Fortune 500 CEOs. That number is now down to 3. What happened? Well, we're existing within a system that is designed to protect property over people. So there were many individuals who felt that these initiatives were unnecessary. And those were the optimists. They felt that it was no longer necessary because look at the progress. And then there were others who deemed these kinds of targeted initiatives around caregiving and racial healing unjust because those individuals were invested in the status quo of power dynamics. And again, that status quo is one in which property is valued over people. And as we reflect on the meaning of June 19th, we also acknowledge that people were property who were misused, abused, and disposed of without sanction, where powerful people within this society were insured for malpractices of social inequality, and that persisted through legislative acts, microaggressions, and street violence at the hands of those who were designated to serve and protect. It also shows up in requiring business cases for equity and anti-racism that would promise a return on investment. Low investment, quick and high return, by the way, to justify human rights, dignity, and concerns for our fellow person. So I've been studying race in the workplace for 25 years, and I do so by centering Black experiences and Black voices, trying to help people to understand what the lived experience is of a Black person who is seeking to navigate their own career and maximize their own potential. And so in that vein, I think I've come up with some language that might be helpful in answering a question that seems to be on everyone's mind right now. You know, what do Black people want? Do Black people want day off on Juneteenth? Is that what this protest is about? Do Black people want all of their major brands to have a Black Lives Matter hashtag on their social media? Do Black people want Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's to go by the wayside? Is that the primary initiative and agenda right now? It's all symbolic. It's about caregiving. It's about servitude, no doubt. So the imagery, it does convey continued investment in some of these power dynamics, but you know, is that at the top of the agenda? Here's what I've learned in creating communities of care that really put these desires at the top of the agenda. The bottom line is that Black people want the same thing everybody else wants. Black people want humanity. They want opportunities to thrive. They want to grow and develop at work. They want to have people seek their input and give them credit and rewards when it benefits the company, just as they would for anybody else. They want to have people bet on their potential and invest in their success, even though they don't look like the company's current leaders. They want to have people who have their back when they're being treated unjustly. They want to be invited to bring their differences to work, not just assimilate in a welcoming, quote unquote, culture where their success is contingent upon their ability to fit in. They want the sacrifices of their lives and their livelihoods, particularly in moments of social crisis like COVID, to be honored and to be rewarded. They want to be key voices that are seen and heard in research, in administration, in matters of public health and safety. They want opportunities to work in healthy systems in which the social determinants set them up for growth and longevity and vitality. They want to be dedicated, diligent, and brilliant, a contribution to their workplaces, families, and communities. But as long as we try to erase race from the consciousness of an economic system and social order that was fundamentally anchored in racist hierarchy, we will struggle to uphold our espoused commitment to inclusion, justice, merit, and equality. Thank you.
Jim?
I just needed to unmute. Sorry about that. Laura, thank you very much for getting us started with your comments. And I'm sure that the participants in this webinar have many questions. And just a reminder to participants, you can send your questions to Center for Values Driven Leadership, and then they will be forwarded on to me, and we can bring those into the conversation. But let me just get started by asking you a question. Laura, I want to acknowledge that right now you must be living in a whirlwind, because this is not the first session that you've done in the last few weeks, and you're publishing and writing and interacting in a very public way for justice and against racism. And you're also a Black woman and a mother, and there's just a lot going on. And so I'm just curious and respectfully want to ask, how are you these days? And how's it going?
Yeah, Jim, that's a question that it's hard to even find the words to answer. It's almost surreal. I'm going with it. I have, I think, a clarity of purpose, and so that's helpful. I feel like the moment has presented itself in this way to not just me, but so many other people that I know directly and indirectly who have been doing this work for a long, long time. I've been talking about race to try to help people understand sort of what's going on another side of the table. It's like race and work in fighting racism is like a channel on an XM radio station, and it plays 24/7. And for some people, the frequency is really strong, and for some people, the frequency is kind of weak, depending on how close or remote you think you are, or how strong your own equipment or technology might be to allow you to tune in. And some people turn down the volume because they can't quite take it. Some people don't know how to change the channel, or they don't have the tools to be able to do so. But there are a whole lot of people who just tuned out. And maybe they didn't know the channel existed, or maybe they heard a little bit of it and said, no, that's not my thing, so I'm tuning out. And now people are tuning in. And so it's a surreal experience to have so many conversations, sustained conversations about these issues. And I think in the spirit of Juneteenth is a bittersweet moment for me. As I talked to a journalist earlier this week, I said, think more like Memorial Day and the Holocaust Memorial and less like 4th of July. I mean, there's a different kind of conversation about fighting for freedom. And the fact that it was over 2 years, as you mentioned, Jim, in your opening, and thank you for acknowledging that, is also, a marker and sort of the time. So part of what I've been wondering is, wow, how different could things have been if these conversations were taken up in this way by leaders and citizens and community members 25 years ago, when I started to do this work, when I started, graduate school. It just makes me wonder. It's a long time coming. I guess it's a short way to answer that, how I'm feeling, but also kind of how I'm reading the current moment.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I can certainly see that, and I feel very much the same way. Here's a question that comes from the audience. How should companies get started now? What's a good first step?
Yeah.
And as a follow-up, can you share the name of organizations you feel are doing a good job, and what are they doing?
So the second one is always a trick question because the minute you put a name out there, then 2 days later, something crazy comes out across the news feed and it's like, what? I will say, when my co-author, Tony Mayo, and I published this piece toward a racially just workplace in November 2019 in Harvard Business Review, we were struggling to find organizations that said anything about racial equality or the Black experience or race just as part of their diversity and inclusion banner at all. So, do want to acknowledge it's a radically different space that we're in right now. And I think it remains to be seen the impact, the long-term impact of many of the steps that organizations are taking. So then let me back into the first question, which is, how can you get started and what are some of the options of things to do? Ella Washington and I, in our piece in the Harvard Business Review about US companies needing to take a stand and fight racism, talked about a 3-step process, and these steps are like interrelated, not sharp sequencing. They all need to be ongoing and inform one another. So I guess more 3-part process rather than 3-step, but it's acknowledge, affirm, act. So acknowledge the injustices and the harm that is happening, not just out there, but also around you. Affirm, listen, seek to understand those experiences. As you're acknowledging and affirming, you're committing to a process of lifelong learning. You're just owning what you don't know, what you haven't seen, what you tuned out over the years, what you dismissed when someone tried to bring it to your attention because you said, oh no, they would never do anything. They're not racist. So therefore you couldn't have been the target of racism. And it was like, if we can't identify the bad apples, then the tree must be great. And so it's that kind of back and forth reflective exchange that has to take place before you can start to engage in any kind of action. Now, in terms of your actionable items, it varies depending upon that sphere of influence, but everybody has a platform through which to act. One that's on an interpersonal level is just trying to look around you to identify some engaging and interested African-American workers. And I think, as my opening comment suggested, there are many, many who remain invisible. And so find opportunities to bet on their potential. That's something that we can all do every day. What that looks like to share power in some way, to help amplify their voices, to give them opportunities to learn and grow and give them the high quality feedback that they need. Oftentimes people shy away from giving feedback to Black employees because they don't want to be seen as racist. So then it ends up being a double-edged sword. You're not getting the feedback, you're also not getting the opportunities, and then you just kind of peter out and you're flatlined. In a broader level, what can companies do? A lot of companies are doing external facing stuff. There's lots of donations, lots of dollars. Thrilled that Netflix donated multi-million dollars to historically Black colleges and universities a couple days ago. My co-editor of Race, Work, and Leadership is David Thomas. He's now the president of Morehouse College. He was delighted, rightfully so. So that was really close. Glad to see that. Glad to see Alexis Ohanian of Reddit continuing to be an anti-racist advocate and activist as he's been in the past, and saying, I personally, as founder, am going to give up my board seat. And I am going to designate that seat goes to a Black person. That's a different form of inclusion, not just add on, but move over. He did it, so that's an important model. But internally, it's going to be even more important than what happens externally. It's about, reevaluating your own talent management systems and your own culture, and acknowledging, uncovering where the racism exists, and then holding people accountable for behavioral change.
Terrific.
Metrics is important too. That's the last thing I'll throw in. And I'm sure that my panelists will speak to that in their comments.
Yeah, I hope we get to that. And Laura, thank you for your response. And I just want to put in a little pitch for Laura's article in the Harvard Business Review, along with her colleague, Ella Washington. It was June 1, I think it came out. It was the article I referred to earlier. And it is in that article where Laura and Ella talk about sort of 3 do's and 3 don'ts. And Laura just mentioned those 3 do's, you know, acknowledge the harm that your Black and brown coworkers have endured, affirm their right to safety and personhood, and help them feel protected, and then act. And obviously we'll be talking much more about ways to act. And Laura, you gave us a number of great examples. And then I thought the 3 don'ts were equally powerful in that article. You said, don't keep silent. And I'm thinking about this as a white man in the context of organizations. And I'm taking your advice from that article to me in a sense. And don't keep silent, don't become defensive, and don't overgeneralize. Listen, try to understand. And I found that to be tremendously helpful. So I'd encourage each of you to go check that article in addition to many other things that Laura has written. I want to bring Selwa and Cheryl into the conversation now. And the way we want to do that is, Selwa, we want to give you some time. And I made a mistake at the beginning. I said Selwa was going to talk about how to build inclusive organizations, but she'll be talking about how managers, what managers can do to be anti-racist. And then Cheryl will be sharing her experiences from Allstate, her stories from Allstate, and then we'll get back into the Q&A with all 3 panelists. So Selwa, over to you.
Thanks, Jim. So there's pre-work to be done before we can start the work of anti-racist. America and its workplaces have a long sordid history of systemic racism, and the silence of white managers has allowed them to reap the benefits of a racist society without actively taking on racist behaviors. So first, they must own that and work through their feelings associated with this, because I believe that everything starts with self-reflection. Then we need to go deep. Who are you? What are your beliefs? What are your values, your beliefs, mental models, your lived experiences, your earned and unearned privileges, and be honest about who you are and where you are in the journey to becoming an anti-racist. Then I say pause and bring those thoughts into consciousness. You cannot have an effective conversation about the identities of lived experiences of Black people if you don't have a critical understanding of yourself and how you are contextually situated in America's long-standing history of systemic racism. Next, I'd say own your learning, lean into curiosity, optimize Google, and navigate your learnings, but don't expect Black employees to educate you on their lived experiences. Instead, commit to a lifelong learning process. And if you're blessed, you'll be able to connect with a Black person who shares the vulnerability of their authentic perspective. Just last week, a white woman who leads an employee resource group reached out to me. She'd taken a training on white privilege and wanted to share her aha moment. She talked about how her and many of her white friends take offense to hearing the words white privilege. And that's because she, like them, had grew up very poor and had to work hard for everything she did. But through that training, she understood what that terminology, white privilege, meant. Now she feels more equipped to have those conversations. She owned her learning. It's also imperative to understand that the languaging of social justice is entering corporate America. So words like racist, anti-racist, white privilege, and white fragility are being used. So it's imperative to get clear on the vernacular, the nomenclature of words before embarking on those race conversations. For an example, if I speak Japanese and I greet you with Ohayo gozaimasu, while you speak English and you hear Ohio got much, you may say, Ohio the state, got much of what? So clearly, neither one of us are understanding each other, and we're not going to be aligned on how to proceed in that conversation. Also, it's imperative to understand in your pre-work that there's a lot of hypervisibility around Black employees now. So managers need to know how to genuinely hold space for our trauma with care and concern. Let us authentically feel how we feel and be who we be. Then try to walk in our metaphorical shoes to understand our lived experiences. But as you begin to identify the burden weight of injustice, make certain that you don't center that experience around you. Instead, deeply comprehend that your metaphorical walk in our shoes does not compare to our perpetual lived experience. And while you may feel pain in that moment, this is not about you. There's an insurgent of painful feelings and emotions that can easily overtake you in this process, but Black people often feel compelled to soothe you and comfort your pain. We try to differentiate you from other white people or then overthank you for your advocacy and support. And that right there is the emotional roller coaster. And that is usually where this work usually stops. So don't go down that path. Instead, stay focused on being an anti-racist. It is imperative that you do this pre-work to get to the real work of dismantling racist systems. And then anti-racism work really actually starts. That's when you start having the conversations with Black employees. Hear them, ask them how you can help, show empathy, but then move to action. Interrogate those systems and structures with magnifying lens and discover all the ways that you can support the equity of Black people. Be courageous, speak up, speak out. Know that this watershed moment is clearly defined that silence is complicit. There is no neutrality in racism. Your employees will see you as either an anti-racist who is actively dismantling racism through your speech, deeds, and power, or a racist who is silently or actively maintaining systems that oppress and exclude people. And that is my.
Thank you very much, Salwa. That was so crystal clear and helpful in terms of very detailed specifics. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Cheryl, I want to turn it over to you, and then we'll open things back up for Q&A.
Hey, thanks, Jim. I won't be redundant with anything that Dr. Roberts or Dr. Salwa has shared already, but I really want to start with this first slide for all of you. And when you're silent, sometimes it's more painful and can do more damage than actually speaking words, even if you don't know the right words to say. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Allstate. And I will tell you, to start off, we don't have all the answers either, but we've decided to learn together to try to make a difference. We held a panel discussion 3 Wednesdays ago. And the discussion was interestingly focused on doing something completely different than what we intended to do. It was going to be 2 Caucasian women talking about raising multicultural young men. And within 24 hours of hosting the scheduled discussion, several of us said, that's the wrong thing to be talking about right now, right? We really need to have a let's keep it real discussion and talk about our stories. We really needed to show up, not just the Black women and Black officers at the company, but we needed everybody to lean in. We needed the white women, Hispanic women, white men that didn't know what to say, but we really need to show up as a united force to say, we are going to address this together for all the reasons that you see on this slide. Amber, if you can go to the next slide. What we did was talked about what it means to be Black, a Black mother, a Black wife, a Black executive. We talked about what it feels like to have your children leave your home, especially your young African-American men. I have 3 of them in the house with me right now. And the pain that you feel because you worry about whether or not they're gonna make it back home safely. We talked about the white men on the team that didn't speak up when they saw people not being treated fairly. And we just talked about how we're a company of people, how we're a nation of people, how our families, how our children, how we're all in pain. And we need to navigate this together. So we started the discussion. We started the dialogue. There were tears, but what we said we would do is be very respectful in our discussion. So we created just some common ground rules, right? And how we expect people to not only behave or behaved on that day in which we held the session, but how we expect them to behave as we navigate moving forward. And so I make these available to any of you that you might find useful, because it's not about a one and done discussion. It's about continuing to learn together. And that's so much what Salwa and Dr. Roberts have talked about. You can go to the next slide. So I've been asked, okay, I'm white, I really don't get what's going on. What am I supposed to say? And if you go back to the first slide, again, you can't be silent. If you're an ally, or if you're just someone struggling to understand, these simple words will make all the difference in the world. Just acknowledge that I see you, I hear you, I'm listening, and I'm open to learning. As Jim mentioned, I am in this cohort right now. We are on day 8 of our 8-day intensive. And I tuned out of Allstate email all week on purpose so I could focus on this. And I was given the space to do that. But to my surprise, when I logged on this morning for the first time, I saw that our CEO made Juneteenth a national holiday. And he's also created a resource called the Resource Center for Anti-Racism. And I shared with our cohort some videos that teach, they were intended to teach people about the history of slavery, the history of Juneteenth. Because if we can't lean in, be vulnerable, and commit to helping everyone get it, we too will be having these discussions, and our kids will be having these discussions 20 years from now. So there's an accountability that we all have to learn together. I said Allstate doesn't have all the right answers. I definitely don't have all the right answers, but I believe together we can do some great things. So thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you for sharing your experience, both personal and professional at Allstate. Very much appreciated. Laura, do you have any response that you would like to make to the two of them, or shall I start going for the questions?
That was powerful. I'd love to hear the questions.
Sounds good. Here's one. Speaking for myself and likely for other white folks on this call, I know many of us want to engage, but we're afraid, sometimes terrified of getting it wrong. What should we know? And any one of the panelists, feel free to respond.
So I would say, what should you know? Know that you're probably going to get it wrong. That's just part of the process. Like something you say, or the way that it's said, or the timing of when you say it, is going to invite feedback. When you open up that conversation, you're going to invite some feedback. So I would reframe it as, it will invite feedback that will help to advance or enhance your learning. If you then translate that into an indictment, right? You were wrong. You got it wrong. You didn't do it perfectly. It wasn't, filled with the profuse praise or the overthinking that Salwa talked about. And then, as of that, you're like, oh, this is too hard. I'm tooling out. Then it's that is the manifestation of white privilege. To opt in as long as it feels safe. Mm-hmm. I think what you're hearing us say when Cheryl says that she fears and I fear the Black men in my life, my little boy, and what the road ahead is for him. He's going into 2nd grade now. Depending upon his behavior in 3rd grade, there are the prison industrial complex that is forecasting the number of prison cells needed based on the behavior and the test scores of Black boys in 3rd grade. Like, this is not out there, George Floyd, who was my age, but this is starting so young. So there's a level of fear and anxiety that characterizes the daily walk for many, for many Black and brown people in our country and around the world. And so in these moments, it requires a different kind of bravery on the part of people who haven't had to sort of put themselves out there and, you know, and get out of their comfort zone. Because truly the consequence of your getting it wrong is not on the same order of magnitude as the consequence of George Floyd getting it wrong for whatever somebody felt justified the course of action that led to his public murder.
Yeah.
And Dr. Roberts, if I may, as you were speaking, all I could process was we have to do this together. When we look at the number of roles that white men hold and the decision-making abilities that they have that impact the lives of employees within their organizations, we need more of you not to get it from the start, but to engage in it and help carry this discussion further, seek to understand. I also believe it then requires people like all of us on the call to be open and willing to have the dialogue, to have the conversation first and foremost, but we can't own that full burden. And so what I have found myself, again, at work, again, if you go back to the slide that I had up, I forgot to point out one really important thing. It's that assume positive intent always. If you are reaching out to me and you want to have this discussion, I'm going to start from a position of compassion because I want to help you get where you need to go, but you can't expect me to do everything that you need to do to get you to the point where you need to be. So just step out there, start somewhere. Because if you are silent, we will not make progress.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Sawa.
No, I echo both of your sentiments. I've been questioned about this a lot in the last couple of weeks, and I say silence is wrong, right? It's complicit. So you want to be wrong, stay silent. Use your voice. It is not easy. It is not an easy conversation, we all have difficult conversations when we're Black mothers of children. So get in the fight. I agree. I go back to do the pre-work. Educate yourself. Google, there's a lot of information. There are plenty of books and podcasts that you can just start to understand the languaging so that we can have these courageous conversations. But it really is a skill, right? Like as a Black Muslim woman, I have been talking about race my entire life. I call it my superpower. As a child, my mother told me, you're a Black woman, Muslim, you better work harder, get your education. I got all the middle class values. So I can talk about race. I've built that skill. If you want to have these conversations, you speak, you start to have them. And as you have more of them, you will create trust and care and concern where you'll have the safety to continue these conversations and you can have a mutual relationship where you grow, but you just have to lean into it. I always say go with a strengths-based approach. If you don't have cultural competence where you don't know how to bridge difference, then maybe you're curious. So ask questions, learn about them through questioning, but use your skill set in order to get knowledge so that you can have these conversations.
I love that.
Thank you for those responses. Amber tells me my audio and video are a little sketchy. And so, Amber, I just want you to know that if it does start to break up, you can feel free to jump in. I want to let you know, Cheryl, and you know, Salwa, that for me, you have been those resources. I have learned so much from the two of you because of your care, your compassion, your openness, your vulnerability, and your willingness to shoot straight at every moment. So thank you for that in my life. Here's another question from the panelists. One participant writes, I'm getting some feedback from white colleagues when we talk about white privilege that they don't have it. They grew up poor or in an abusive family, and I feel like I need to do a lecture on systemic racism with facts and figures and charts and graphs to explain it to them. that it's about their race? Are there resources out there, and how do I explain it so they get it?
Dr. Roberts, I'd love to hear from you on this one too.
Well, the first thing I would say is that the narrative of progress within our country is a struggle narrative. It's a narrative of overcoming. And so in order to construct and sustain positive identities, people co-construct individual and collective narratives of progress and overcoming obstacles. So even the wealthiest person in this country will tell you a story of one of their foreparents who, quote unquote, came to this country with nothing, or a great-great-grandfather who struggled in another land far from here. It's built into the fabric or the core identity of the United States of America. And so I think that's one of the barriers that makes it challenging to have conversations about privilege when everyone is so invested in their own struggle narrative that it can sort of turn into an oppression Olympics of sorts. And that doesn't end up getting us into the outcome that we'd really like to be. We can't talk about race without talking about how race, as a system of advantage and disadvantage, without talking about how it intersects with gender and class. So that's why, for instance, some of the statistics that I shared with you were about women of color disproportionately represented in low-wage caregiving roles. That's a commentary on race, gender, and class, and how they all sort of converge. So when you just look at one point of comparison and say, well, I didn't have it easy growing up either, fair enough. But there may have been a confluence of factors that intersected that made it more challenging or difficult. With white privilege, in that case, you can say, well, of all the challenges and struggles I had, none of them were due to my race. That's white privilege, and maybe people gave me the benefit of the doubt on some things or were more willing to bet on my potential, when I was the unlikely candidate, because I reminded them of their younger self. And as a Black woman, when somebody in that position of power looks at me, they aren't going to have that same sense of familiarity or identification with my younger self. So, those are some of the things that I try to use to explain. I also use some different kinds of metaphors and analogies to talk about, the oppression around race and the toxicity of racism compared to, many of the other freedom agendas, right? So your freedom to violate a pandemic, the public health order or the local ordinances and mandates because you want to get a beer or a haircut or have a barbecue or a graduation party on the beach is not the same as the demonstrations that are taking place on the part of freedom when it's clear that Black people are being disproportionately murdered at the hands of police and self-designated citizens who take on their role as responsibility to police Black people in their communities and may even result in loss of life. So we have a lot of false equivalencies that we have to wrestle with. But in doing that, I think it's okay to validate the fact that everybody has struggled. And part of the American story in building in that degree of universalism and connection is the struggle.
Thank you. Selwa, Cheryl, anything to add?
I think Dr. Roberts hit it on the head. I can't add to that.
One of the things that I think you helped me see very clearly, Salwa, is that this country was built for me as a white guy. I can get up in the morning, walk out into the street, go to church, go to work, go to the grocery store, go anywhere I want to go, do anything I want to do, and nobody is going to question me and much less threaten my life. Because all of the laws, all of the systems, all of the structures have been built for me. And unfortunately, they were built on the backs of Black people and through genocide of Native American people. And that's one of the ways that has helped me understand white privilege. This nation was built for me, and it allows me pretty much complete freedom. And that's not true for our colleagues of color.
And Jim, if I can just add to that, I'm sorry. I think personalizing what you said is what has made the difference within my workspace. So explaining to, the thousands of people that tuned into the town hall that when we moved out of the city into the suburbs, the first thing I wanted to do was take my 3 Black young boys to the police station because they were driving, introduce them, give them pictures of their cars and their license plate numbers so that they knew that they belonged in this community. Because it wasn't 15 years ago that I was stopped less than 10 miles from where I live because I didn't belong. And so people don't expect that that happens to people, I say like me, with a title, but it happens every day, all day. And so personalizing it also helps people to understand the opposite of white privilege.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I'm getting signals from Amber that we have only 3 minutes left, and so we need to bring things to a close. I would like to give each of the panelists just 30 seconds each for any concluding words or comments. And then I have a couple of announcements, and we'll try to wrap as close as possible to 1 p.m. Central Time. Cheryl, can we start with you, and then Selwa, and then Laura?
I'll go fast. Just as our CEO said, it's just us. Everything starts with us. And I believe together, just us can be served. So thank you for the opportunity, Jim.
Thank you, Cheryl.
So I'd like to say that regardless of your hierarchy in your organization, you can help create equity for Black and brown and women folks. Challenge your companies on their board and their C-suite composition, interrogate the talent management practices, ask for an annual audit of pay equity, performance ratings, voluntary and involuntary exits, engagement surveys of Black people, insist on standardized talent acquisition practices, require at least 2 Black candidates on the slate, use structured interview guides, a diverse interview panel, use metrics and leader expectations, influence the high visibility projects, the mentoring, the sponsorship, and the high PO programs, ask about succession planning and the promoting of Black employees, disrupt your own biases and challenge unsubstantiated feedback during talent reviews, address microaggressions. If you're planning meetings, ask who's not at the table and give fair and frequent high quality feedback. And most of all, stay committed, because being an anti-racist is an iterative process that requires lifelong learning.
Thank you, Selwa.
Thank you. What I'm taking away is that we have an immense amount of resources and insight within our own communities that can help us to carve a path forward. So I would just add that we're at a critical juncture. It's been a time of massive disruption. And when we've had to rally and make radical decisions to sacrifice for the common good, we were able to do that. And fighting racism is going to require that same kind of response. It'll be massively disruptive, and we'll have to make sacrifices on behalf of the common good with an eye toward the least of these, but I think there's no better time for us to do that.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks to each of you on the panel, Cheryl, Selwa, and Laura. Thanks so much for spending this time with us and for helping us to learn and helping us move towards action. A couple of announcements. One, a person asked about resources. Amber is going to be sending out a link and resources that that you can use around white privilege, white fragility, around how to become an anti-racist. Things like that, so be looking for that. Also, we have coming up 2 additional seminars. The first will be on July 9 with Dr. Stephanie Creary of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and she is an expert on understanding identity, diversity, and inclusion and how it links to leadership, and she'll be talking about that. Then in August, we will have a seminar with Dr. Stephanie Johnson of the University of Colorado Boulder. And she's just written a new book called Inclusify. That is a great explanation of why inclusion is so vital to great organizations and great leadership. So please join us for those. You'll be getting information about them from our colleague, Amber. So with that, our time is about up. I just want to thank the panelists once again and thank all of you in the audience for joining today. With that, we are adjourned. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.